up on me. And I don't know how that happened, but time goes by so quickly that I just can't really get a grasp on that. Which means November to me is the month of Thanksgiving. And so it's coming up. And on November 22nd, from 3 to 11, there's going to be a free dinner. It's at the community building in the town park of Delavan, and everyone is welcome to attend. Please do not celebrate Thanksgiving alone. Be with people, celebrate what God's doing, and tell people about this. So on November 22nd, from 11 to 3 at the town building in Delavan Park. Second is, what comes after November is December, and that's our first opportunity to serve the men through the men's homeless shelter. And so we need some help with that. We need some foods, we need some helpers, we need people to just volunteer to help these guys. We were talking this morning, very first thing, about encourage each other and build each other up. Well, I'll tell you what, these guys are in need of some encouragement, and it feels good to build them up. So if anybody has any questions, there's stuff on our website on how to help, but also you can see Jonathan Bradley. Jonathan, raise your, there he is right there. Yeah, see him, and he can give you any of the particulars about that. Also, Jonathan is needing some help too. We are going to have a food distribution, but we can't do that until we organize what we've got, and that's downstairs. So Tuesday night, this coming Tuesday from 4 to 6, if you can just contribute a little bit of manpower and a little bit of time to help Jonathan organize what's happening downstairs. We're not sure how long it's going to take. It might take one day and it might take another. So watch your social media and watch for your emails to see about another date, maybe in the near future, to help get that done. So, hi, Jim.
Oh. Tonight, at First Baptist Church at 6:30 is Harvest in Harmony, and it's a ecumenical effort for food pantry. I don't know if you all know about it, but it's at 6:30 tonight. 3 or 4 or more musical groups. It's all music, no preaching. Admission is a can of food, and they will pass the bucket to support the food pantry.
Oh, great.
And
great.
yeah, they need to network that a little better. Tonight at 6:30, First Baptist Church.
Great. Thank you. Wow, we like those kind of things. Yes. Yeah. Next week, put him on the schedule, Rachel. Lastly is the connection card that's on a seat near you. Please take some time to fill that out. We don't want to know anything. We don't want anything from you. We just want to know you. And I can tell you right now that I'm a person who reaches out and asks for prayer. There is nothing more important than have people joining with you to unite with you in prayer. God inhabits the praises of his people, and I'm telling you right now, whether you have a prayer petition or a praise, write it down on this card, because we have a prayer team that's powerful, and they like praying for you. So, with that being said, I'm talking about prayer. Close to my heart is prayer, and Pastor Zach has been teaching us every week about prayer, and I want to know more and more about it all the time. So today he's going to teach us a little bit more about prayer. Thank you.
Tony always says that she doesn't like being up here to give announcements, and every single time I get the opportunity, I tell her, "You're great at giving the announcements." Right? Make sure you tell her today, yeah. First thing I want to say, which is really weird to say, a year ago, almost today, I was here with you for the very first time, which is crazy. And I remember that for this simple fact alone. Tomorrow is Veterans Day. And if you yourself are a veteran, or if your family in any way has had someone serve in any military, from the bottom of my heart, from my family, thank you so much for your service. And it's really important to continually thank those who give themselves selflessly. So, veterans, thank you so much. Tony alluded to this just a couple minutes ago. It feels like we're moving quickly through time. It's getting close to that time again in the year where we're 2 weeks away from Thanksgiving, but really we're 2 weeks away from Black Friday. And if you go out, I have a story. I'm not going to tell it because it would make me mad. But when you go out to like the malls or to the stores, everything is a buzz, and people are cutting you off and just trying to get their own thing done, and you're so frustrated by everything. And you hear Christmas music. Those Christmas music enthusiasts among us are like, this is my time of the year. They've been holding back for months now, right? Like that's what it feels like. And they're like, the Hallmark movies, they're like, no. Christmas movies have been going 24/7 for like 4 months now. Now you're just getting ready for my time in the year. I'm excited for it. That is not me. I'm not excited for all the buzz. I'm not really excited for like all the holiday parties and all the busyness. Because I feel like all that happens in the next 2 months is just like our calendars just get bogged down. Everything gets busier. And it feels like, oh, we hear like the most wonderful time of the year, but it's like the most cluttered time of the year. I'm not ready for it. I don't know about you. Like I look outside, like the other day and it's snowing. I'm like, no, it's not time yet. But I guess it is time. It feels like everything's just kind of melting together, where the days just come and go too fast. Lately, Sarah's alarm goes off. And I take the dogs out, and then I make the coffee, and then I take a shower, and then we're off for the day. Either in meetings or in, like for me, writing sermons or sitting with people. As I go from one place to the next, I just like turn on the radio, and I listen to the sports radio, talk about how terrible the Packers are playing, or how great Giannis is, or like, I try to listen, and just like from one place to the next, I'm trying to fill my space, my empty space, with more stuff. Outside of my sermon prep, I try to set aside time just for Scripture. Based on the busyness of my day, it's sometimes hard to get into. Because throughout the day, I do all that stuff that I was talking about. Then I'm home, and then I take my dogs out. We do a few things around the house. Then Sarah gets home usually. We complain about not wanting to make any food. We complain about having to make decisions about making food, and then usually we just go out to dinner because that's who we are. And then we get home, we sit down for an hour or two, spend a little bit of time together, but mostly it's just on our phones because we're busy. We're just like, what are you doing? I'm sending an email. I'm doing work. And then all of a sudden we're in bed just to wake up and do it all again the next day. It feels like, to me at least, in my life, one season is just melting into the next season. One day is melting into the next day. Soon it'll be Thanksgiving. Then it will be Christmas. And by the time we know it, it's going to be 70 and sunny. Amen? And it's hard to feel like, at least for me, that I'm really gaining traction in anything that really matters in my life. Which is one of the reasons why I really wanted to take time in this series to take a step back and explore and study how Jesus did what Jesus did. What were the words that Jesus prayed? How did Jesus get away from it all and pray? Because time and time in the gospel, we find that in the midst of all of the busyness of Jesus' ministry, Jesus intentionally gets away from the busyness to pray. Sure, in the Gospels, Jesus went from city to city preaching the good news and engaging people in conversation about the kingdom of God. He spoke to masses of people. He healed anyone who would come to him. For 3 years, Jesus focused on investing in the lives of other people. He mentored 12 very closely. He encouraged them. He served them. He answered their questions. He taught them how to live, and he taught them how to love. He taught them how to be like him. And because of that example, because of his example to his friends reached thousands of people, transformed people's lives all throughout the region. He established churches throughout the world with the good news of the gospel. In just 3 years, Jesus leveraged his ministry to start this movement. In those 3 years, he did far more than anything that I probably will ever do in my life. But how? How was Jesus able to do all of that stuff? How was Jesus able to be so successful? How was he able to invest so much in other people's lives? Where did he get his strength? Where did he get his compassion? Where did he get his wisdom? Where did he get all that stamina to serve other people? And we tend to dismissively just say, well, Jesus was the Son of God. He was God. He wasn't going to be rattled by all the busyness. He was God. Jesus was the Son of God, and we could simply end the argument there, that that's where he got his power from. But I don't think that that would tell the whole story of who Jesus was and how Jesus did what he did. Yes, Jesus was 100% God, but he was also 100% a person. This means he wrestled with human stuff too. He didn't have special transportation like the Pope. He had to walk from place to place. He probably had foods that he didn't really like to eat, but people put them in front of him and just ate them. Jonathan this week asked me a question. Is there any biblical evidence that Jesus ate more than bread and fish? I was like, there are a couple things that he probably ate, but he probably ate just what everybody else was eating. Which doesn't mean necessarily that he liked everything that everybody else was eating. He just ate it because that's what people ate. Jesus had to deal with human stuff too. I don't know if Jesus was a morning person or if he was a night owl. There's probably some biblical scholar out there that wrote their entire dissertation, like hundreds of pages, on whether Jesus liked the mornings or the evenings. I guarantee it's out there. Because Jesus was a person, he probably had a preference. He was either one or the other, just like you and me. All of that to say, he dealt with stuff that you and I deal with on earth. Yet when life was busy for him, when the calendar was constantly full, when there were demands on his time, literally people breaking through crowds and having to touch him, he didn't just go through the motions. He didn't just go from one season of mundane life to the next. I think this is important for us to note. When he was in the midst of the messiness of other people's lives, it's clear that he lived this life. He lived this inside-out rhythm of his life. He was consistently going to God in prayer. Because really, it's in that intentional conversation and his relationship with God the Father that he was nourished to do the things that he did. Because of his connection with God the Father, he was able to love people well and serve people well. He was able to minister to the masses. Here's how he describes how connection to the God the Father works. In John chapter 15, he says, I am the true vine. My Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. So this inside-out metaphor that Jesus gives to us is really important for us to learn from. He teaches his friends as he's talking about what it means to be the vine and the branches. He teaches his friends that each of us need to become like the branches, abiding in the vine, finding nourishment in the vine that's tended by the gardener. Jesus is teaching that the power for us to bear fruit, the fruit of love for one another, comes out of intentional efforts to abide in God the Father. But for us, it's hard for us because in the midst of our busy lives, in the midst of our task-oriented lives, our list-making lives, there's a lot of times where we just go through the motions. There are times where we feel like we're not living for really a purpose other than just checking things off the list. And I've found that it's likely when my life gets busy, it's likely my connection to the vine, my connection to the source of life, my connection to the source of power, my connection to the source of all things. It just becomes another one of those things to check off the list. And I find that my connection with God some days gets cut because the other things become more priorities, higher on my list of priorities. I have to worry about, well, I got to get this done, I got to get this done, I got to get this done before I can really go to God. And God, he's got grace for me. He's got the mercy. He's going to forgive me. I just got to get this stuff done, and then I can get to the God stuff in my life. Yet as I look at Jesus, and I think about the connection that he has with God the Father, he has to the source of life. His connection with God the Father wasn't just another thing to do. It was the most important thing to do. In the midst of his busy days preaching and teaching, he made it a priority to get away and be alone with his Father. What Jesus taught, he lived. Jesus practiced what he preached. He was the vine, or he was the branch who abided in the vine for nourishment. This is on display many times in the gospel. We read a couple here. Mark chapter 1, verse 35. Rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. And then in Luke chapter 5, verse 16, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Now Jesus didn't just tell his disciples, you have to be branches, and I am the vine. God the Father, you got to be connected to God the Father. He didn't just tell them that. He said, I'm going to do this as well. He went to desolate places to pray. He went off and away in the midst of crowds to pray. His inside-out rhythm of life is the example of how intentional time with God the Father gives nourishment to go out and be God's hands and feet in the world. Jesus' ministry was an overflow of his oneness with God the Father. And if you think about this verse in chapter 5, you have to understand what's happened before it. In chapter 5, Luke records Jesus cleansing a leper. And once he's healed, this is what it says in verse 15. Even more, the report about him went abroad, and great crowds gathered to hear him and to be healed of their infirmities. Jesus cleansed the leper. He does this amazing miracle. And word got out about his healing power. And because of this, crowds from everywhere came to hear him preach and to teach. They came out of the woodwork to be healed of all the diseases, all the infirmities. And Jesus is getting popular at this point, but Luke, in this verse, Luke says that there's one thing that he would always do, even when he's busy with his teaching and with his healing. Chapter 5, verse 16. He would withdraw himself from the crowds to places where he could be alone, and he would pray. Now, there are more than just these two passages in the Gospels that tell us that Jesus went away to pray. That he prayed alone, he prayed in long spurts of time, he prayed for other people in this time. Again and again in the Gospels, we see him withdraw from the crowds to go and pray alone in quiet places by the lake or in the hills or in the desert or up in the mountains. And in the Scriptures, we see that he's constantly sharing his heart with God the Father. He's constantly going to God the Father with his heart, and he's saying, sometimes, think about the garden. He comes to God and he's like, I can't handle this. I need you to take this. He listened to God the Father. And ultimately, he submits to the leadership and obeys his Father. Even in the midst of the busyness, even in the midst of having to check things off of the list, in the healing of people, in doing life with others, Jesus was exactly like the branch that we read about in John chapter 15. He was always connected to the vine. He was always connected to the source of nourishment. This was the inside-out rhythm of his life and his ministry. He was connected to God the Father because of that connection, because of his constantly going to God the Father in prayer. He was able to love and serve others in just extraordinary ways, in ways that you and I just wish we could. And all that leads me to do is to look at myself in the midst of the busyness of this season or next season and ask the question, how can I live my life like Jesus lived his? How can I live more of an inside-out rhythm of life? How can I be more like Jesus in this way? You might be like me, feeling bad about how many times I would choose to just check the things off the list rather than go to God in prayer. It's not like that I don't want to be better connected to God. It's just that in the busy realities of my day, I tend to focus on other things. I know that I'm supposed to be someone who prays. I know that we as a church, we have to be a praying church. I know that. For some of you, you got that. You understand this. In your life, you are a prayer warrior, and that's just something that you do like from morning, noon, and night. That is just what you do. You pray. I wish I could be more like you. For others, though, a consistent, constant prayer life is really tough. Sure, there are some seasons in our lives where like this mountaintop experience, we're like, we just want to pray all the time. And that makes sense, but you come off those mountaintops. And it's not as easy to be in that space where you're like, that makes me feel like this, and I'm really connected to God the Father, and then you come off and you're just like, I just want that back, but you can't have that back. There's some of us who struggle with being in the valleys, especially in our prayer life. We tend to cherish the moments when we're on top of the mountain, but those moments really are few and far between. It's in the gaps between those moments we get inundated with life and our priorities shift. It's in those seasons where we find it more difficult to have that constant connection to God the Father. I'm reminded of the story of Mary and Martha, where Jesus goes to their house for a meal. And the story speaks to the heart of priorities. It speaks to where we invest our time in and what motivates our choices that we make with our time. This is what's happening, and you probably know the story. It's in Luke chapter 10. Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. Martha was distracted with much serving, and she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me alone to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. See, Martha's worries, her anxieties, keep her from sitting at the feet of Jesus, while her sister Mary is sitting there soaking up his words. Martha is running around trying to prepare the food to serve the guests, checking things off the list. Luke describes her activities as distracting. Jesus calls her anxious and troubled. While her work to serve and provide food for her guests was a good thing, for her it became the most important thing. It took priority over her heart, making her anxious and worried. The distractions, the things that she had to check off the list, they got in the way of her at Jesus' feet. Think about this. Jesus is in your living room. Just think about this. Jesus is in your living room. What are you doing? Like, you're probably saying, oh, I should probably make sure that I'm a good host. You know, if you've been to someone whose house is just like, they're always busy, they're running around, but Jesus is at your house. Just think about this. Like, it's mind-boggling to me. She is the incarnate God sitting in her living room. And she's just doing her thing, and her sister Mary's sitting there. I feel like in seasons where everything is rushing by and I got to just check things off the list and I got to go from one place to the next, I'm always looking forward to what's coming up on the list rather than what's coming up in my relationship with God. I feel like I am a lot like Martha in this story. So often in my life, I forsake being in the presence of God in order to check things off my list. I get wrapped up in the details and the duties of the responsibilities of being a pastor to even check in with God. We often think if we just get one thing done, if we just get this one thing off the list, then we can experience relief. Then we can experience like a lack of stress. If you're like me though, sometimes I feel like when I've gotten through my list of things to do, I'm like, oh, finally I can spend time with God. But then something else kind of gets in the way. It's constant. It doesn't end. It's like this, like if it's not one thing, it's the next. There's no such thing as living a life out from the outside in, right? You understand that. Like, we can't just be on the branch by ourselves and experience survival. We can't experience life out on the branch without being connected to the source of life. That branch doesn't survive long on its own. And our priority, as made clear to us by Jesus, our lives ought to start with God the Father. Not just be dropped in certain times in our lives, but it has to start with God the Father. But when this is not the case, when that connection isn't high on our checklist, when it's not a high priority, this is what Martin Luther says. Satan gets the victory. Imagine the joy Satan has when we choose activities over sitting at the feet of Jesus. That's why Jesus says to Martha that only one thing is necessary. It's the same one thing that David spoke about in Psalm 27. He says this, "One thing have I asked of the Lord that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all my days, all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, to inquire in his temple." The one thing that Jesus talks about, the one thing that Luther talks about, the one thing that David is talking about in Psalm 27 is the connection to the source of all things. And there are many things that we can do in our day. Some of them are worthy and important, but nothing, not even the good things in our life, should interfere with the one thing that's important, that Jesus says is important, that David says is important, that Luther tells us is important. When it comes right down to it, there's only one thing that's vital in our lives. Luther knew it, David knew it, Mary knew it, and certainly Jesus knew it. The connection to God the Father is vital for our life. And when we as individuals, or we as the church, when we realize that our connection to God the Father, when we're constantly seeking being in God's presence, it's in that connection that we're able to see things from a different perspective, a kingdom perspective. When we are connected to the vine, when we're connected to the source of nourishment, we have greater clarity as to what we need to do to invest our time in the things that actually matter. Because being in God's presence means being able to see things the way God sees things. All the little details, all the little checklist things, they just seem to fade when we're focused on the right one thing. When we're connected to the source of all things, when we live our lives in a way that mirrors Jesus' inside-out rhythm of his life, we see that whatever God has called us to do in our lives, God's going to equip us and empower us in our efforts. I cannot believe that investing our time in prayer, investing our time in connecting with God the Father, in communion with God, will take away from other things. On the contrary, I believe that investing our time in prayer and communion with God the Father will only give us wisdom in order to fulfill the things that God is calling us to do. That will fulfill us in our ability to check things off the list. Our list becomes different when we're connected to God the Father. As individuals and as the church, one of the things that we want to be known for here is our prayer life. And we say that we believe in the sovereignty of God. We say that we want to be known as being a church that has an inside-out rhythm. We want to be a church not just doing our own thing, not just putting our mission in front of God and saying, God, come alongside us. We want to be committed to going to God the Father first, to being connected to the vine, being connected to the source of nourishment. With that, though, we have to be willing and honest about talking about where we are in our efforts. We have to be talking about how we, like Jesus, practice what we preach. I know what I've said today is not like mind-boggling, that like if I tell you you need to pray more, you're like, yeah, no, duh, that makes sense. And I understand that. I'm not trying to blow your mind here. I'm just trying to get you back to the source of all things, the one thing that's important to us. If you've been in church for any length of time, the pastor, the preacher will always be like, you got to pray more. Yeah, no, duh, guy. Like, I understand that. I'm not trying to say like, hey, guys, this is... what I'm telling you is just going to blow your mind. No, I understand that. Prayer is supposed to be central to our lives, and if you have spent any amount of time in the church, you understand that. If it's a daily practice for you, if you show up every Sunday and you're like, I need to just pray, great. But today, I want to be talking about how we as a church, how we can become more of a praying church. How do we practice what we preach? Because if we don't get it inside these walls, how are we going to take it outside those walls? How are we going to, if we don't pray in here together, how are we going to be able to pray out there with people that are saying, no, no, no? So it's important for us to practice what we preach in here, especially when it comes to prayer. We're going to do a little activity a little bit later. But first, I want to tell you how you might be able to pray. How you might be able to engage in prayer in a different way. Maybe you pray every single day. Maybe you pray like as soon as you wake up. Maybe you pray before you go to bed. That's great. If you aren't a prayer, if you're just like, it's not my wheelhouse, let me just give you a couple suggestions how you might be able to pray differently this week. Rachel heads up our team, our gathering space transition team. And in the first meeting, this group of people was talking about how, like, what kind of spaces are available to us potentially. And at the first meeting, Rachel asked the team if they might be able to or join her in the practice of fasting from some sort of food, some sort of drink, some sort of activity. And in doing so, in fasting from that particular thing, instead of partaking in that, you use that time to pray. And Sarah's like she's supposed to be sitting here. Like, that's where she usually sits. Get out of here. Sarah, like, she'll send me a text. Actually, I think I sent Rachel the text, and she's just like, I didn't drink the Coke today because Rachel told me not to. I was praying instead. I'm like, great. I sent that screenshot to Rachel. I'm like, it worked. She's praying. So that's important. Like, if you have something in your life where you're just like, if I just put this aside, and instead of doing that, I'm just going to pray. I'm going to pray for these people. I'm going to pray for that thing. I'm going to pray these words. Whatever it is, if it's fasting away from something, I would say, just try that. Try that this week. If you want to pray with other people, on Tuesday night, Tony talked about it earlier, Tuesday night, 6:30, in the office, we have a group of people that get together every single week, and they pray. Yes, they pray over the prayer requests that you'll put on your prayer cards, but they also pray for our community and our country and our world. And if you feel like you just want to be around other people when you pray, they're not going to, like, point at you and say, you must pray. You could just sit there and enjoy being in a time of prayer. And again, they go to Culver's after, and you can join them unless they tell me that you can't, which I'm sorry. But you could just simply go to Culver's and sit at the table next to them and have your custard or chili. They like chili. Another activity you can do. A few weeks ago, like I said before, I'm not that great of a prayer, and I'm not like just sit alone and like pray on my own. So I decided I bought a book. It's like this thick. It's called the Book of Common Prayer. And it's got prayers for every day, morning, noon, and night. Every day, like January 1st through December 31st, like all the days. And I've been going through. I sit down after I take my dogs out, after I make the coffee, before the shower. I sit down, so I might stink a little bit. I sit down on my couch with my dogs and my coffee, and I pray for 5 minutes out of this book. And you don't have to like buy a book this big. Maybe you find just a book to go through, a devotional book. Just spend some time. That's not a crazy thing. 5 minutes is not crazy, but it's that intentional time. I need to figure out where I'm at. I'm making stuff up on the fly. If it's a podcast, there are people that talk about prayer. There are people that, like, there are books on prayer. Just do something. Like, being connected to the source of all things, to the source of nourishment, that is important for us. And as a church, we want to be able to say, like, we rely on the sovereignty of God. We want to embrace what it means to say, God, what are you doing here? And being open to listening to what God is saying to us. I heard a podcast actually this week. They said this: if you're too busy to pray, you're too busy. That's true for us in our lives. If we want a life that reflects God the Father, I think if we take Jesus' example, his example of living an inside-out rhythm of his life, being connected to the vine. If we take his reliance on prayer as an example for our lives, if we just look at Jesus, Jesus prayed and he prayed often as a church and as individuals. Just look at Jesus' example of how high the priority should be for us to pray. Today we're going to practice our core value of relying on God's sovereignty, and we're going to embrace as a church the importance of prayer. Usually we have you write down your prayers on your prayer cards, and don't get me wrong, you can do that if you feel comfortable in doing that. But as a family, it's our intention to be authentically present with one another, especially in times of joys and especially in times of concern. So this morning, we're going to have an opportunity to lift up our prayers out loud. Or if you feel more comfortable writing them, or if you feel comfortable just sitting in a time of prayer by yourself and praying. We're going to have some space, though, that if you want to share a prayer out loud, Mike's going to walk around with the mic. All you got to do is put your hand up. If you have a joy, if something like just you have a Thanksgiving you want to pray, awesome. If you have something that is going on in your life or your family's life or someone in the community, you have some sort of concern, I'd invite you just raise your hand. Mike's going to run around with the microphone to you, and you'll have an opportunity just to share whatever it is on your heart. So I'm going to begin the prayer. I'm going to end the prayer. And when the time comes, I'll ask if you feel free to share. Raise your hand. And again, don't feel like we're pressuring you to pray. If you just would rather pray silently, great. If you want to write on you, like this is a great time to write a prayer on your prayer card as well. This is just a simple practice of praying as a family, being a community of people, trusting in the sovereignty of God, together as one body. So, would you pray with me? Good and gracious God, there is absolutely no one like you, Lord. Lord, we trust your heart and your intentions. We trust you completely. We want to be people who come before you and listen intently to your voice in our lives. And as one body now, God, we lift our prayers, both spoken and silent and written, to you. We know that you hear each of our requests. So at this time, if you'd like to lift up a prayer, just put your hand up in the air, and Michael will come around with the mic.